celebrate World Breastfeeding Week, I'll be reading from the Breastfeeding Journeys chapter of Milestones of Motherhood, where mums share their really varying experiences of breastfeeding at all different places along that journey. So, as individual mothers coming to hold our babies for the first time, nothing feels so personal and intimate. Yet we seldom realise we're mothering in times of unprecedented social change. Sustained historical and continued influence of cultural, political, and economic forces have combined to all but decimate collective social and biological wisdom regarding nurturing our infants. Beginning to understand these influences helps understand our individual breastfeeding journeys. Just as birth has become a controlled, medically managed affair, with knowledge and skills taken out of women's own hands and communities, so too have we all but lost sight of our collective wisdom for feeding and nurturing our babies. For the greatest part of human history, breastfeeding is how infants were nurtured. Children grew up seeing women of their families and communities nourishing their babies at the breast, and such skills were embedded within the culture as simply how things were. Yet, from the 18th century, medical professionals extended their reach into infant feeding, suggesting alternative food sources as being superior to a mother's milk. Over time, such influences became widespread and established, undermining breastfeeding as the optimal way to nourish and care for babies. Dismantling collective skills and wisdom. Over the last century, formula companies have become highly lucrative and powerful corporations that profit from the decline of breastfeeding. Such financial and hence political clout is powerful and widespread, influencing medical research, training, and professional practices alongside aggressive global marketing, despite the World Health Organization's recommendations for exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months and breastfeeding to continue for 2 years and beyond. Over time, such forces have skewed our ideas of infant feeding, undermining breastfeeding as the norm. Science continues to discover health promoting qualities of breast milk for physiological, immunological, emotional, and intellectual development, alongside numerous health properties for mothers. Yet it does so in a culture so pervaded by corporate interest that much misinformation and misunderstanding clouds the breastfeeding process. Therefore, much advice we receive from those around us, however well intentioned, is often unknowingly influenced by scheduled formula feeding and usually undermines the breastfeeding process. We find ourselves holding our babies, beginning our journey unaware of the many ways these invisible corporate, political, and social landscapes undermine us. Such influences surround us and can take root within, ebbing away our confidence as we wonder if we will be able to do it, if we should give it a try, and whether or not our milk will come in. Hazel, mother to Barnaby at 15 months. In our antenatal breastfeeding session, the midwife asked how many of us were going to try breastfeeding. Most of us put our hands up, me included. Then she asked how many were going to breastfeed. That really made me stop and think. She explained the percentage of women who can't make enough milk is vanishingly small. Yet so often you hear women saying they couldn't breastfeed because they didn't make enough milk, whereas more likely with the right support and confidence in themselves they could have carried on. So even before our babies are born, we're undermining ourselves with thoughts that it's difficult, it might not work, and so on. I resolved that I was going to breastfeed. I would make it work. If we face difficulties, as many of us do, and the support we receive does not resolve our difficulties, rather than seeing our experiences stemming from vested economic interests, instead we blame ourselves and internalise feelings of guilt and failure. I hope this brief introduction illustrates breastfeeding is about so much more than what we do with our own babies. Understanding the cultural background helps reframe our personal experiences within the wider context. And Gabrielle Palmer's The Politics of Breastfeeding is an excellent resource for further understanding. The journey begins for many of us before our babies are born. For some mothers, breastfeeding barely features on our inner landscapes. It's not something we've seen much of and feels unknown and uncertain. So we go with formula as this is what we know, can access most easily, and feel most comfortable with. Yet a great number of mothers would like to breastfeed. Of that number, some want to give it a try, and for others, there's an awakening within and they know it is what they'll do. Marie, mother to Jean and Louis. Before I had children, I knew I'd been breastfed and knew if I had a baby, the next thing to do was feed it. When Jean was taken to special care, they said they wanted to feed her a bottle. My response, no you don't. I was so determined no bottle would go into her mouth. I got them to cup feed her my expressed milk. The early days were difficult, but I wasn't going to give up. Near constant feeding followed for a while. It became easier and so convenient. No bottles to worry about, milk on demand, and tailor-made nutrition. And Jane, mother to Sarah. I was always going to breastfeed. I'm sure there's an element of luck, as in most things with parenting, but I also think there's an element of attitude and expectation. Mindset plays such an important role. My daughter latched on early and stayed there for a number of hours. The tone was set for our breastfeeding journey. It always felt very instinctual. We co-slept and I carried her. She fed as and when she needed, through illnesses and wherever we were. And Shelley, mother to Leah and Anya. Breastfeeding was something I was going to try, and it was hard work at first. Seeing her cues, positioning her wriggly body, trying to get her to latch on was tricky, but when we got there, it felt great. In the middle of my first pregnancy, a friend gave me a copy of La Leche League's The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding. Until this point, I thought I would breastfeed, but I gave little thought to what this might entail. This book opened my eyes to the many ways breastfeeding supports health and development of babies and mothers, and introduced me to ideas of responsive, on-cue feeding and gentle attachment style parenting. I eagerly read about the supply and demand process, in which feeding baby at the breast for as long and as often as they like builds and establishes our milk supply. This preparation soon came into its own, as from her very first feed, my daughter, whilst latching on and feeding well, struggled to keep her milk down. Yet, thanks to my reading, I wasn't put off. I continued to feed as she indicated and held her upright after a feed, which seemed to help with depositing. I had no experience with breastfeeding, yet had developed a belief and trust in the process. Had I not had this information behind me, I would have felt much more worried about her bringing her milk back up and being vulnerable to advice which could have undermined our fledgling breastfeeding relationship. Certainly, trusting the process was a milestone, and preparation during pregnancy was key. As we learn, so too do we come across the feelings and experiences of others. We soon realise people have differing views and hold many opinions which undermine breastfeeding's supply and demand process. We see the embedded normalcy of scheduled formula use and how this has become entrenched within beliefs, experiences, and opinions. Harriet, mother to Riley and Leon. I never considered not breastfeeding. It wasn't until a friend said I might not be able to do it, or it might not be for me, that I realised how many women don't breastfeed. I guess with my own mum and auntie's breastfeeding, it was the norm for me. I feel lucky to have that, as it must be harder if friends and family don't value it. So much of our journey is influenced by what we see around us. If we have grown up seeing breastfeeding, It's more likely to be the norm for us and may not feel like such a remarkable decision to make. Yet the opposite is also true, and it's here, in our subconscious observations of life, that the invisible influence of artificial feeding takes root as the way to feed babies. I think my decision to breastfeed and the perseverance and strength that demanded feeding twins came from my personality, maturation, and background. Growing up on a farm, I see it as a normal thing to do. Growing up seeing animals feeding their young. But perhaps if I'd grown up in a city, I wouldn't have that vision. Perhaps people don't see it at all, let alone see it as normal. Natalie, mother to Sam and Oliver. Certainly, our background influences our experiences, yet, as emerging mothers, we create our own path, weaving threads of our past along with hopes for our future. It is this path of creating our mothering style, which is rich with potential for growth, learning, and transformation, and breastfeeding provides rich terrain for such growth.